All right, welcome to Go Beyond Conversations, where we meet intriguing people who are not afraid to go beyond their perceived limits as they craft a meaningful life in an intentional way. My hope is that you'll find role models, practical suggestions, and inspiration, motivation to invest in your own growth path. So get ready for a rich conversation I'm confident will inspire you to go beyond your perceived limits. Our guest today is Boyd Varty. So welcome, Boyd. Thank you. I know it's evening your time in South Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. So what I'd like to do at first, before we get into the questions, can I just give a little bit of background on you for the people watching?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. And then correct me if I make a mistake or say it wrong, then you can correct me when you answer the question. So hopefully I got it right. All right, okay. Boyd is the author of The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life, a wonderful book I have recommended to many of the executives I mentor. And he grew up in kind of a remote part of South Africa, just on the border of Kruger National Park, the son of quite adventurous and unconventional parents. And also his uncle is very unconventional and adventurous as well. Your childhood made me quite envious, I have to say, because you grew up actually interacting with the animals I just read about in books: the lions, the leopards, the zebra, the buffalo, the elephants, the crocodiles. Sometimes that's not so exciting. And so the thing that I'm thinking about when I think about your childhood is it was amazing that you had this connection with the wild. And as I read your books and listen to your podcast, this is a kind of a running theme. Is this the wild within you, and how we can all tap into it? So of course I'm going to ask you about that. And the other thing that you had the great benefit of is learning from the Shangaan people, and particularly the trackers who practice this ancient art form of tracking animals. And you use this as a metaphor that any one of us can use as we try to craft our own meaningful life in an intentional way. So I want to ask you all about that. But before I do any of that, I want to say congratulations. You are a new father. Your son is 3 weeks old about right now. Is that right?
About a month old.
A month old. Okay. So you're the new father, first time father of a month-old baby. I know that you've had many wild adventures in your life. I suspect this is going to be the wildest of them all. Welcome to parenthood.
Thank you. Thank you so
much. It's not about
That's
you anymore, right? So would you told me when we talked before that your son's name is Boyd after you, but his nickname is Veld, I think Afrikaans for wild or wild space. Can you talk about why that's his nickname, and maybe also just your thoughts on being a dad for the first time?
Well, I mean, obviously the first thing is it's an incredible rite of passage. And there is a certain inbuilt maturing that is fundamental to that experience. And it is because the minute you have a child, you're not the most important person in your life anymore. And that has, I felt really the current of that. It's funny, you can get, I'm 41 now, you can get deep into your 40s and still need to mature in many, many ways. So it's been a profound rite of passage for me. You know, sort of central to my work is the idea that we all have a part of us that is wild, and a part of us that's, I would say that wild self, we're almost born with it. It's almost like a code inside of us that we come in with. And that wild self is full of knowledge about how we can be most fully expressed. And then overlaying that wild self is what I would call the social self, and that is social conditioning that we pick up along the way. And we need some social conditioning, but in many cases, the social conditioning is so strong that it starts to crush that wild self. It starts to drown out the innate knowledge inside of us in that primal instinctual place. And so one thing that I have returned to a lot in having a child is that there's so many questions, there's so much uncertainty. And I notice if I can get still enough and go inward, having grown up amongst animals, I just trust that there is something in me that knows how to do this. And, you know, you can read a million books and there are a million theories and other parents will tell you things. And I like to resource myself, but ultimately I'm finding that we are wild, we know how to do this. And to go inward and trust myself has been a powerful lesson so far.
I love it. It's and as I'm listening to you, I can feel the energy. There's a kind of wildness too in the way that you speak and the excitement that you have for others. Okay, so let me dive into the question here about your really amazing experience in nature. So you don't just talk the talk, you walk the walk. So you spent 40 days and 40 nights living on a platform in a tree, kind of a tree house, but without a roof, in Landolosi on the property where the wild animals run free. So you had many encounters with wild animals around you. And I'm curious if you would talk about your relationship, like what comes to mind as you reflect on those 40 days and 40 nights. When I listen to your podcast, which by the way, I recommend all of you to listen to Boyd's podcast, it's Track Your Life podcast. It's really interesting. And that's the very beginning is this story, right? But what comes to mind? You talked about wanting to follow the archetype of the mystic in nature, was what you called it.
Mhm.
And also learning how to track, honing your tracking skills. But also, I think becoming more deeply connected with something inside of you. It was very rich. But I just wanted you to riff off of it. What comes to mind, or how do you talk about this experience to other people?
Oh, wow. Well, in some ways, the first thing is that I grew up on the property in the wild eastern part of South Africa here. So I grew up tracking and I grew up in this environment. So a lot of people, when they hear you're going to go and live by yourself for 40 days and 40 nights in nature, especially in places where there's lions and leopards and animals, to some people that would fill them with fear and trepidation. But to me, the wilderness is an honest place. And it's a place where if you attune your attention and if you learn the language of the place, if you learn how the animals talk to you through their body language, if you pay attention, if you listen, if you understand how everything fits together, it's actually an incredibly honest environment. And so some people think, you walk out in the wild, something's going to kill you. No, if you walk out with attunement and awareness, actually you can be very much a part of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing, just for context for everyone. I'm very comfortable in this environment. I went because there are over 60 or 70 accounts in multiple different mystical traditions of people who were on the path of what I would call awakening or stillness, going to be alone in nature. And so I was really interested in that. Jesus went for 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. Buddha went into the grove. And so I was intrigued by that idea. And there was a question, why did at some point all of those people who were on the path of stillness, why did they go into nature? And so then COVID hit, and suddenly, everything closed down. And I'd always wanted to go for a longer period of time, but there were commitments and work things. And suddenly it was this possibility where I could go. And so I spent 40 days and 40 nights in total solitude, and I never felt lonely. I felt in deep connection with the animals. I got to know in a very personal way the tree that I lived in, the birds that would come and feed on the fruit in that tree every morning, a buffalo that lived in that area and would feed in the river and then move up onto the bank in the midday. I got to know a bushbuck that would feed down the northern bank and then up the southern bank, and became this very personal experience of being in connection. I felt like when you put your attention on living things, when you put where your attention goes, your life goes. And if you put your attention on living things, it's almost like more aliveness comes into your body.
Mm-hmm.
Living out there, I started to see that there is a series of interlocking intelligences, and that's what nature essentially is. And the biggest insight was that after 40 days of living alone and being very still, it's impossible to think that you are somehow not a part of those expanding ripples of intelligence that interlock with each other. You just start to feel yourself in connection with it. And that's a very, very profound and expansive experience. And in some ways, there's other funny things about living alone for a long period of time. One is you notice that you never get into moods, and you realize that so much of the time, moods are unconsciously trying to make other people know something about you.
Right.
I would notice that if I it was a very clean like anger. If I banged my hand on my trunk that I had my food in, for a moment I would be angry about it, and then it would pass. So when you put all of that together, a feeling of being living in this incredible intelligence, the feeling of vitality of being amongst alive things. It was just a very, very profound experience of feeling like deeply, deeply connected to everything. And, you know, I think it was St. Francis who said, um, for him, nature was a place to see the creator speaking through creation. And I felt that. I felt like, wow, there is some order and intelligence that is so visible here, uh, something beautiful and wild and savage. And the more I'm here, the more I feel like every day I am a part of this beautiful unfolding.
Yeah.
And yeah, so those are some initial thoughts on that. It's funny. One other thing on it is that, and for people who are on the transformational journey, you know, the natural world is a wordless environment. You don't see lions sitting around going, yesterday I missed that buffalo, and next week I don't know if we'll ever kill again. They're not projecting past and future. Lions are in a state of wordless presence. And then a knowing comes into them, an instinctual body knowing, and they start to move on that. The evening starts to get cool and they start to hunt. So what I tried to do a lot while I was out there is I tried to not live in my rational brain. I tried to drop down into my instinctual body and try and be in that open, non-verbal state. And just, if I was tired, I would rest. If I was hungry, I would try and find some food. If I needed to move, I would move. And I just tried to be in a different state of consciousness, one that was much more instinctual and what my body needed versus the stories of my mind. And
Wow.
that was really, really powerful.
I love this. And one of the things that I love about it is the connection, the concept of connection. And I think one of a common lament that people have in modern society. I live in New York City, and so you kind of feel the distance. There's a kind of distance. And
Yeah.
I sometimes joke with my kids. I say, kids, there's this thing called nature. You should totally check it out. That's kind of like a joke that somebody in an urban environment would
Yeah.
say. And so that's what I love about listening to your podcast and reading your books is you feel the deep connection, and you're having it literally like you're in it, but it always runs through everything. So I think part of what you're offering is to become attuned to that
Yes.
track, to the fact that we are living creatures and part of a broader system. But what can you just digress for 1 second or expand on? You said dirty anger, and I remember when you talked about this. I really like this concept. You said clean anger, and then you
Yes.
in your podcast you added dirty anger. So you said clean
Yeah.
anger. You described it for a second, but can you draw that distinction? I think this is helpful for people when they feel anger to maybe make a
Yeah.
distinction between one that serves you and one that may not serve you.
Well, you know, you could use the word pain in the place of anger, although you can use anger. I would say there's clean pain. Clean pain is like let's say you stub your toe while you're walking across the room,
Mm-hmm.
and for a moment, just like, that's incredibly painful and it hurts, and then you release it. That's an appropriate response. That's a clean pain. Now, what happens is where you get dirty pain is where a story starts to come in now that starts saying, you see, you always do this. You're clumsy. You can't be trusted to do anything. You always mess everything up. And that story, long after the incident, starts to play out as a narrative about some fundamental aspect of your identity or some constructed story about who you are that's coming out of that single experience. And so almost always, you know, in the both of us in the coaching field, I'm saying to people that we all have stories about ourselves that build up. Some of those stories can be generative and supportive, but a lot of those stories are things that we've accumulated over time, and a lot of them are not helpful anymore. And if you have a really deeply embedded story about yourself, it's funny, the mind will seek evidence for its beliefs. So whatever your story is about yourself, you start creating that. And part of what I'm saying to people is if you feel stuck, or if you're at one of those phases in your life where you feel like you've reached a ceiling, you're doing all the right things, but it doesn't feel alive, it feels calcified, but you have a
Mm-hmm.
story of what you have to do or who you are, a role you've become stuck in. If you want to find your way out of that, I think that you have to be willing to let go of the rational, who I have to be, who I should be, what's required of me, but this is how everyone does it. These stories we have that form our identity and our role. You have to be willing to say, okay, if I'm looking for more aliveness, for something that feels like it's a fuller expression of me, more purpose, more meaning, you have to start tracking. But I grew up tracking animals, but what I think of now is what you're tracking is aliveness and energy in the body. We have to start dropping down and feeling like literally those people, these places, these experiences, when I'm with them, I feel literally energized. I feel myself leaning forward in my chair. And then when I think about this other thing that I have to do, and that's my role to do, I literally feel myself shrinking down. When you start paying attention to that, I think that the body is wild. The body will tell you where your path and where your mission and where your purpose is. And I think if you follow that, it'll pull you out of the rational, but it'll start pulling you into some interesting things.
Yeah, interesting is definitely the right adjective there. All right, I'm gonna ask you a practical question, but I want to frame it with the last day. The last day of your 40 days, you had this. It was incredible. You said you wanted to hone your tracking skills, and you saw lion tracks, and you'd given so many examples of tracking them. It's really hard to find. But on this day, you kind of just felt the energy. So rather than following the actual specifics of how to track a lion, you almost just you felt your own energy and then followed that energy. And then seriously, dude, you emerged on the line. So that was just crazy for me. And it sounded like that's what happens when you surrender. So there's some version of this there. But what I want to say, and then tell me what you think about that. But so here's in that scenario, the lion didn't attack you. But you do have some practical advice, and for someone growing up the way you did, on what you should do. And I want the people watching this right now. Most of you may never find yourself in this situation, but personally, I like to have a store in the back of my mind of, just in case, if I happen to find myself in a situation where I'm unarmed and there is an angry lion who's actually aggressive and coming at me, you know how to survive this. I do not know how to survive this, but will you explain what is the technique one should use when facing an angry lion charging you and you are unarmed?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing is that when a lion is aggressive towards you, the first thing that happens is it sounds like someone started a dirt bike in the brush up ahead of you. You just start hearing this terrifying sound, and then the lion appears and it locks you in its gaze. Its tail is lashing, its ears go back, its entire body tightens, and it starts to walk at you. And at that moment, you have exactly one option, and that is you absolutely have to stand your ground. If you run, it triggers an almost instinctual reaction in the lion and it'll chase you. The one thing that a lion is afraid of is your courage. And so what I do in that situation is I breathe out and I drop my energy and I realize, because I've mentally prepared myself, that this lion is communicating with me energetically. And what it is saying is, you have come too close now. And so long as I am able to meet that energy in a way that is asymmetrical to what the lion is used to, so you have to meet the energy with intensity and with presence, but then very quickly, once the lion has come at you, and usually it'll slam on the brakes within 5 or 10 yards of you, and sand flies up into your face, and you just are face to face with the most terrifying energy. You have to meet the energy, and then very quickly, after you've stood your ground, you have to convey to the lion that you mean no harm, and start to then slowly give ground and say, okay, I've heard what you're trying to say to me. I'm going to start to move away. And what's incredible about that experience, and I've been in it many times because we run a safari business, we track lions, we find lions for people who've come all over the world. There's some things about it that you can learn from life. One is that you should be mentally prepared for that moment. So you should have visualized that moment. You should have visualized yourself in it, and just be prepared. Now, upstream of that one of the challenges is that you can avoid that moment by deciding to never go tracking. But then you lose out on so many other incredible experiences that you can have there. Other people, what they do is they pretend to go tracking. And they get out and they walk around and they do all the things, but they do it in a way that they'll actually never find the lion. Or you can actually decide to go and track it, knowing that there's a chance it will come at you. In that case, you are going to come to face with it. You are going to have to work on your skill as a tracker. The thing that makes you most safe is tracking is a craft, is your ability to read the tracks, be attuned to the calls around you, be deeply in the psychology of that lion so that you can predict. We're getting very close now. Ideally, you see the lion and you move away from it before it sees you. You want to track with people who you trust, who you've taken time away from tracking to build a trusting relationship with. So I'm lucky at Londolozi, we have some of the most incredible trackers. But the hours we spend together away from tracking, where we get to know each other, we get to trust each other, we have high trust and high faith in each other's competency. In the moment when things are really going down, the work you've done away from the coalface of that moment is what allows you to react well together, take care of each other. Working on the craft of tracking is what keeps you safe 99% of the time. So you could say in your own life, there is something out there that is beautiful, inspiring, slightly scary. To go and find it, you'd have to step out of your comfort zone. You'd have to be willing to work on the craft of tracking in the hope that you could find it. And what that would be for you is following something in your life or career that requires you to pay attention, to grow. And there is a chance that that thing is going to come at you and scare the hell out of you.
Right.
And
maybe
if it does, and if it does, yeah, your best bet is to stand your ground and look it straight in the eye. And you should not go for the fear of that moment, because afterwards it is those moments that are the things that fill our life with meaning, aliveness, purpose. And if you develop your skills in pursuing those type of things, mostly you can face the big scary moment. And that's what I've learned from tracking lions.
Wow, I love it. So yeah, so look, just to reinforce this metaphor, I remember in your first book, Cathedral of the Wild, you wrote about this, and there were two quotes I wrote down. You mentioned both of them, but I want to highlight them. The lion is afraid of your courage was one thing you wrote, which was so interesting. This thing that could literally eat you. You have no chance of winning hand to hand, hand to paw or claw, whatever. But the lion is afraid of your courage. So that's standing ground. And then the metaphor of some people decide never to go tracking, right? And so this is the people who follow safety and don't grow. And we're creatures of growth and transformation. And you wrote, even if you're terrified inside, stare it in the eye. So that's the metaphor. It's literal in the case of surviving, but it's the metaphor for the choice each one of us makes to live full of vitality, right?
And I think, there's this incredible Joseph Campbell quote where he says, people are not looking for the meaning of life. They are looking for the feeling of being alive. And that to me has become everything. What I am actually tracking, my background is I grew up tracking animals. And then when I got into, when I was 21, I met my first mentor, and she was an incredible coach, personal transformation space. And I took her tracking, and afterwards she said to me, we do the same thing. I just watched you track a rhino, and the way you're attuned to certain signs, the process at which you approach it, the willingness to go tracking without knowing what you're going to find and work with attunement and presence. I do the same thing when I help people look for what they're looking for. So that suddenly that became kind of my frame. And since then, what I've been tracking, what I believe the track that is in all of us is the most aliveness we can find. And in order to be attuned to that track, you have to be tuned into your body. You have to feel how your body says to you, yes, that is joy in the body. That's energy in your body. And you have to cultivate enough presence to be aware of how your inner track is speaking to you. And so the presence piece comes from the lions too. You have to be free of all of those roles and stories enough that you can actually sense what's going on inside of you as you approach your work, as you approach what calls you forth, as you approach business relationships, personal relationships. You actually have to feel enough. It can't just be the projected mental story you've developed about something. And certainly if you want to do something original and new, in my experience, if you want to really track into personal expression, almost always you have to step away from the rational idea about who you should be and what you should be doing to be successful, to be on the right, to do the right thing, and feel more towards where there's actually energy for me. And so, what I'd say to listeners is if you want to be a tracker, you don't have to go tracking lions, which although you should come at some point and do that. But if you want to track, what are you tracking? As you hang up this call, you are tracking what literally physically energizes my body. And if you start to pay attention to that, it'll be really interesting where that starts to pull you, because it'll pull you towards natural curiosity, towards unusual situation, interesting people, and things that you couldn't have imagined. This is what I should be doing. You'll just be like, oh, there's energy there for me.
All right, I love it. So let's make this practical. And I'm going to do an advertisement on your behalf. Boyd did not ask me to do this. I'm doing this of my own volition. So Londolozi is the name of your family safari business. That's just outside of Kruger National Park. I have been there. I have experienced the trackers finding the lions. It is quite an experience. So I'm totally advertising it. For those of you who want to blow your mind and have this amazing experience, go to Londolozi in South Africa. Look it up. It's amazing. But the thing that I didn't realize before I went to Londolozi, of course, I was expecting to see some amazing animals and have trackers who knew what they were doing and guides explaining it all to me. That's kind of par for the course, I think, for if you go on a safari. But one of the things I was really struck by about Londolozi was the community. It is a community, and you all have invested heavily in one another, and including the people who live nearby, the Shungam people who live nearby. They are the trackers and also work as staff. I know you employ many people, so there's this symbiotic relationship between your safari business and the local community, as well as, of course, the animals themselves. What can you talk about this process? And I'll frame it. I work with a lot of CEOs, executives, entrepreneurs, people who are trying to nurture and invest in a culture that attracts and retains high quality people, high integrity people, results oriented people. And I know that you've worked the trackers I experienced, both the trackers and the guides, I worked with them. Can you talk about the specifics of how you recruit and find and also don't hire certain people? Like, what's the process of bringing this in and the investment in the community itself?
Yeah, okay, so maybe can I go back for just 2 seconds and just give people a brief context? So
Please.
on the land was bought in 1926 and it was a bankrupt cattle farm. And my family originally went there to hunt until 1969. It was a hunting camp when my grandfather died, and there were animals there, but you didn't really see them because they had been hunted, they'd been shot out, and also the land had been overgrown by the scrub as a result of the cattle overgrazing. So in 69, when my grandfather died, my father was 15, my uncle was 17, and to prevent losing the land, they launched themselves into the safari business. And it probably would have failed if not for the arrival of this incredible ecologist called Ken Tinley. And Ken said, if you want this place to work, you need to partner with the land, you need to think of the animals as your kin, and you need to involve the local people and create an economy of wildlife. And bear in mind, this is apartheid South Africa, 1971. And so my father and uncle, very young, they launched themselves into this. They started literally pulling out the scrub and restoring where they were losing moisture through erosion. The grassland started to return, and the animals started to appear. Into the midst of this, a single female leopard started to allow herself to be seen. And we called her the mother leopard because word got out that there was a place in the middle of nowhere in South Africa where you could go and see a wild leopard. And that gave tremendous energy to the place. So those were our beginnings, the sense of connection with land, connection with people, building a model that could inspire restoration of wild places. So those were our foundations. And then very quickly we realized that, and it came through a love of the place, that really what you needed to be effective in Africa was incredible relationships. And so we started to, in apartheid South Africa, our vision was to, guided by various people in the area, was to pour the cultures together and to start to create a space that defied the laws of South Africa at that time. And what we learned in that was we started to make human decisions over business decisions. And then we started to realize that by making 100 human decisions a day versus the right business decision, we started getting higher outcomes in the business. And so if you made decisions that cared for people, that cared for staff members, we started to realize that if you helped a staff member with something medical, if you helped a staff member because something had happened to their home, if you started to create the sense that we were in this together, you started to get incredible outcomes of service to people who were coming to visit. And so that was the beginning of the culture of Londolozi, and some of it was in defiance of the regime of apartheid at that time.
Yeah.
There was also an incredible alignment. There was this idea that we are here, a single vision. We are here, all of us, to give people incredible experiences in nature. And if we do that, that serves the entire village. Another thing that we did is we've always hired energy over credentials. And that has been incredible for us. Finding people who are characters, finding people who are unique, finding people who are passionate, finding people who are energized. They might have never taken a safari, been in hospitality, anything like that. But we hire energy because energy attracts energy. And so when you start to put that together, human experience, hiring energy over credentials, and then you start to compound it over time. You start to, and I think that's very, very important. If you make, multiple decisions every day that are about the importance of the relationship versus a cold business decision, and then you compound that after time, you start to get an incredible community of people who feel motivated, cared for. We're also very driven. And then what happens is you get a gravity to culture. If you can get a critical mass of people in your organization who profoundly understand your values, your mission, they start making human decisions over cold business decisions. They start being obsessed with caring for everyone, staff member, guest. It gets a gravity, and then word starts to get out that there's something going on at this place, and that starts to then pull talent. One thing that I say to people when they're recruiting all the time is that if talent is real talent, um, they can get a job anywhere and they can get a high comp anywhere. Real talent often knows that they're real talent. They can go get a big job. And what they're looking for is to be on an incredible ride with incredible people, doing something unique and unusual, something that they can really believe in. And what we found over the years at Londolozi is that by making those type of decisions that on the day seem like, such a woo-woo business decision, over time, that has started to prove that we don't need to recruit the most high quality people come and find us. And so it's become this like self-generating recruitment system too. The culture recruits the culture. It's really, really amazing. So I think those are a few things, finding moments to care for people, finding moments to show appreciation. We are the only safari lodge in South Africa that doesn't have a union because we have such high trust with our 270 staff members. And we have just found that investing in the relationship has 10x. We have a 40% repeat business down in the southern tip of Africa. That's people coming from abroad. 40% of our guests come back from, and it's far away. It's hard to get to. It's a big commitment, but it's because they feel something there. And a lot of that has had to do with being irrational about how much we invest in the well-being of our staff.
Right. In this case, irrational is very rational, of course.
Well, that's the thing about it. But if you were to look at it in like a cold light, if let's say a sort of a McKinsey came in to do an analysis, they would say, your costs are way out of whack on caring for staff. And wait, what's this whole medical thing here? And this bursary program and this, like, it's too much. And then we would say to them, it is those things that drive the guest experience and result directly in the repeat business that we have.
I'm not going to argue with success. As I said, I've been there, and for the record, I'm going back. So yes, you got another repeat customer. I will say, you're reminding me, I saw this lovely ad at a bus stop in New York City. It's for an animal shelter. And it said, the pay is low, but at least the hours are long.
Yeah, that's cool.
And there it is. So there's something beautiful about that. So you've got this wonderful energy that I love that you said the culture, it recruits the culture. So
yes.
there's so much in that.
Energy creates energy. And I think one thing that I would say to CEOs who are building culture is you are the head storyteller of the village. And your job is to is to create context for everyone. So I really encourage people who are leading to tell your story, tell it continuously. There almost always there's one person who's holding the sort of why of why we're here and what we're doing. And you have to constantly be conveying that to people, even people who've been working in your organization for 10 years. Someone has to keep reminding everyone why we're here and what we're doing and the context of what brings us together. What do we share?
Mhm.
And so be clear on your story, develop your story well, and tell it regularly and with intensity. You know, one thing, I'll tell you one anecdote if we've got time, but
Please keep going. I love this.
you know, when my father, when I was growing up, I grew up around campfires, and the lodge was not what it was today. It was a startup. We had a couple of mud huts, and then we had a few chalets, and it was building. It was very much like make it up as you go along. And guests would come in and they would go track a lion or they would go track a rhino, and often like they would be a bit nervous by the experience, and then sometimes like the lion would look at them and someone would be afraid and a whole lot of things would happen. But then that night around the fire, my father would usually tell the story again, because that's what you do when you're on safari. You tell the story of the day. And in his story, he would cast the whole story as we had this incredibly exciting experience, and the way that lion looked at us, and the way you, Jim, were able to take that picture despite the fact that your heart was racing. And he would tell the story, and then people would leave, and in some ways they would tell the story in the way that they had remembered it that night around the fire. And that's when I realized that a lot of leadership is creating context and helping people realize how they should be relating to anything that happened, how they should be thinking about it, what they should be feeling about it. And if you can help create that context for people, they get better at telling the story themselves. And so, and then that becomes the law of the business, of the culture. It becomes sort of a shared story that we all tell. And when you get a group of people with a shared language telling a shared story, that is culture. And within that shared language, in that shared story, we know how to act and behave and show up because that's who we are.
You're reminding me of you wrote about this, and I love that you're bringing this up. Is the power of stories, and human beings, we're creatures of storytelling. We grow up on them, and then we don't even see the world the way it is. We tell stories about the world, and this is one of the reasons I think we're politically divided. They're just two very different stories, and you tell a different story. You look for the facts that support your story. But one of the things you said, I remember, I don't know if I'm quoting you exactly, but you said there's the experience, and then there's the story of the experience. There's what happened, and then there's what we say happened, and those are two different things, right?
Yeah.
And there's power that, and then there's also. Oh, please go ahead.
No, exactly. There's the way we're all doing it all the time. We're projecting our story onto any given situation, our story of who we are, our story of who they are, our story of why. And what presence is to me, it's the ability to be somewhat uncluttered by those stories, so you can experience what's really going on in the moment.
I love it. I'm writing it now. Uncluttered by the stories allows you to be in the moment. So this is back to your example. The lion isn't anxious about, will I be judged by my fellow lions next week if I can't? Right.
Yeah.
The lion's uncluttered.
That's how we are narrative creatures. And then at the same time, out of that presence, if you can really be attuned, you can start to tell rather a story that depletes and keeps you separate, a story that starts to bring us together, starts to weave together the meaning of what's happened. The one thing that I say is that storytelling is attention, because if you are going to lead a company, a family, a group, an organization, and you want to find your way out of the cultural story into your own unique story, you have to be able to see what's actually going on. You have to be able to pay enough attention to see what's actually there and tell that story not out of conditioning or out of ideas, but out of presence. And a story that is full of the presence of what actually brings us here has a real energy and aliveness to it. And that is culture. You know, and another way of saying it would be, you can tell if people are telling a story of an organization that is old and calcified. The organization has changed, but we're still telling the same old story. But you can feel that's an organization that is in decline because somehow the people, what the organization is actually doing and the story we tell about it are somehow divided. They don't add up. And so as the leader, you have to stay attuned to how the organization is changing and be telling that story out of that alive, actual connection with it. Otherwise, it just becomes old propaganda, you know?
Sure. All right, I want to build on everything we're saying. Let me shift a little bit, and go. I want to go back to you. What I find fascinating is the decisions you've made as an adult, and the risks you've taken, and this growth that you're trying to explain to us. You're living it. These aren't just words for you. You are an embodiment of these concepts, and you're just trying to use language, and you have really beautiful poetic language here. But I want to take it. Let's make it very specific about your childhood. I'm looking at my notes here. I'm thinking about your wonderful teacher, Kate. So now let's go back to your early teenage years. You had this mixture of the quote bush education, the bush meaning basically the wilderness that your Uncle John would take you on, and when he would shoot his amazing nature documentaries, and your teacher Kate would take you and your sister Braun and teach you out in the wild. You had that mixed with a traditional education at a boarding school where you had to deal with bullies. And when you were talking about the kind of honesty of the wild, that humans are not like that. And so with a lion, you can tell me exactly how to interact with a lion. With a human being, it's not that simple, of course. And so one of the things but where I'm going with this is, now that you're a father, I'm wondering about your perception for those of us who have children, or whether you have kids or not, really isn't it. But I'm curious about a comment you make about the danger of no danger. So you were raised like genuinely in danger. There were moments where you absolutely could have been killed. Your family Cessna could have crashed. You guys were all dead. You could have been gored. You had a black mamba go over your legs, which that's 100% death. So you got all these. You have these literally dangerous occurrences in your childhood. And then as you become an adult, you've got this risk-taking side, and this really interesting poetic perspective and a sense of connection and energy that we can all feel. Maybe can you riff off of this concept of the danger of no danger, both from the perspective of raising a child and trying to protect the child, and then maybe just from the individual's perspective of a life without danger?
Yeah. Well, you're right. We had an unconventional upbringing. We were educated first in the wild here. And a lot of that was from the time I was young, we were taught how to cultivate presence in situations that could potentially be dangerous. So from the time I was young, my uncle taught me to read the body language of animals. And he said, if you can read their body language, they're talking to you, they're communicating with you non-verbally, and you need to be aware of that. So I was always very attuned to that. He taught me, he used to have this game where he'd throw me in the river, and then you would get washed down a kind of a rapid, and then he would grab you at the bottom of the rapid. And so I jumped in the top of the rapid, I got washed down, and then instead of grabbing me, he ducked under the water to kind of scare me, and then he missed me. And I got washed down river, and eventually he ran down the bank, and I tried to swim to the side, and eventually when he grabbed me, I was like 6 years old, I started crying, and immediately he said to me, hey, no crying. When you panic, your brain turns to, he said, when you panic, your brain turns to sponge. And he was saying to me, when you panic, you need to something's happening, you need to get calm. And it was the first lessons I got on starting to try and go into presence instead of, a frantic panic. So there was that dimension of things. And then recently I've been thinking about the situations that we would go into. And what I realized is that there was always risk, but the people around me, even though it was potentially dangerous, my uncle took me tracking lions from the time I was 5 or 6 years old. The people around me had confidence, and I could sense their confidence. And their confidence came out of their competence. And it was like, as a very young person, I could feel that they trusted themselves in situations. And I think about that a lot now with my own child. I realize, again, like I don't want to avoid the reality that we live in a wild place, and I don't want to just keep him away from it. And I think what it asks of me is to continue to develop my competence so that I can take him places and feel and understand that there's a risk, but trust myself within that risk profile.
Mhm.
Um, so I think we've lost that a bit in modern society. We think that we can make it safe enough, but from the moment you're born, life is given and life can be taken away. And I think it's rather what I'm coming to is that what's important is to cultivate our own self-trust, to cultivate genuine competence, to work in our craft, you know, to work at whatever you're doing. For me, it's being in nature, but to get really, really skilled at that to the point where you can trust yourself and feel confident going into those sorts of situations. I think that's how I relate to it now. Um, and again, to realize that there's risk, but if you bring attunement to it, if you cavalier in the wild, or if you think you're gonna be bigger than nature, nature's gonna educate you very, very quickly. So I think
I'm sure.
that humility is is really, really important. Humility and yet confidence of having been there, but not false confidence, a confidence of really understanding your environment.
Right. This feels like a fine line because bravado is not what you're talking about at all. I'm
Yeah.
looking at my notes. One thing, Kate, you know, your wonderful teacher, a quote or that you said about her. You said that she quote. She's talking about you and your sister Braun. She challenged us to invest in our own learning, teaching us how to teach ourselves. And I heard a
Yes.
version of that in your response, where the
Yes.
competence comes from competence, but competence doesn't hand it to you. Competence is from
No.
work and from focused work, being very specific about what you're trying to learn, right?
Yes. And one thing is that when our parents, the reason we came out of school and we did these few years of traveling is that my parents were building safari camps around Africa. And they were standing on the edge of the Ngorongoro crater and the sun was setting. And my father looked at my mother and he said, why are our kids in a boarding school somewhere where they're not experiencing this? We can't have any influence over them. They're not kind of in life, they're away in this institution. And something about that rubbed him wrong. And so that's why they took us out of school. And then when they were going to take us out of school, this was 1994. You know, people do more pod learning now and homeschooling. There was none of that in South Africa. When they took us out of school, everyone said to us, this is a terrible idea. Your kids won't know how to be socialized. Your children won't know how to have relationships. They'll be deprived of sports and all basically like you're gonna come out with people who don't know how to be social. And then my parents were confident enough in themselves that they pushed through that. And instead, we ended up living in Maasai villages, living in India, meeting people from radically different backgrounds. And the exact opposite of what everyone's socialized thinking about how education works turned out to be true. We ended up having incredible relational skills because we were put into environment with very different people. And so I just say that to say, you know, anytime you want to do something a bit different or try and live differently, people will sell you their fears. And quite often it's the willingness to do something different that results in a totally unexpected outcome, and very often the opposite of what everyone's fear is. There will be challenges, things will go wrong, but it's almost never the thing that everyone tells you you should be afraid of and why you can't do it.
Right. I love people will sell you their fears. I love that comment. This is
Yeah,
what I love. You've got these great one-liners. So let me bring this to the Lion Tracker's Guide to Life, the book I mentioned. This is Boyd's written two books. You've written two books. Cathedral of the Wild was your first, and then the Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. One quote from the Lion Tracker's Guide to Life, you said, going down a path and not finding a track is part of the track. Losing the track is part of the trail. And I love that insight because it might talk to some of the fears that people might try to sell you. It's like, what if a version of what if you lose the track? And then, of course, everyone's famous favorite line from this book, of course, is, and this was from Rainus, the guy, the tracker that you studied with, who, when he was tracking lions, at one point he said, "I don't know where we're going, but I know exactly how to get there." right? And
Yeah.
I have to say, I've stolen that quote from you. I always give you credit,
Good.
but I've stolen it. It's such a great line. I don't know where we're going, but I know exactly how to get there, right? But so maybe can you talk about so how you use this, your track your life system, and maybe how you work on this way of being in the world where tracking is the metaphor.
Yes. So what happened is when I transitioned out of guiding people on safaris and I started working in this apprenticeship in the coaching space and in the personal transformation space, what happened is I started to realize that all those hundreds and thousands of hours that I'd spent tracking animals, it converted very well across to the process by which someone changes identity, goes through a transformation, and finds a more fulfilling path, what they're really looking for, what I would call the track of their life. And so if you think about tracking an animal in the wild, there are a couple of things that have to happen. The first thing is if that lion roars somewhere out there in the wilderness, the first movement of tracking is you have to go without knowing. Like you can hear the roar out there, you can hear the call, but you don't know exactly where that animal is. You don't know where it's moving. You're in a wilderness area the size of Switzerland. There are no guarantees about finding it. The first movement of tracking and the first movement of personal transformation is to start without knowing. I've coached hundreds of people now, as I'm sure you have, who said, when I know exactly what the next move is, then I'll make moves. And what I've said is this transformation stuff starts by being willing to try things without being clear where it's going, what the next full expression of your career will be. You have to be willing to start. Then what I would say is you need a first track. And the first track, when Renier said, I don't know where I'm going, but I know exactly how to get there, what he's saying is, in an infinite wilderness, and this lion could have gone anywhere, I have its first track. Then I have the next first track. Then I have the next first track. And then the next first track. And the skill of the tracker is to dial down the infinite possibilities to a single next step, a next first track, and then a next first track. So wherever you are in your life now, and in your transformation, you can say, I have to start without knowing. And I have to, but today, is there one thing that I feel like might be a first track? One way I could move towards something that feels a bit more energizing. People, places, experience, something that feels a direction in our business that I just feel like I have no idea why, but there's a bit more energy there. And that is how you work with the first track. Then what I would say is you have to develop your track awareness. Now, like Charles, if we went and walked down a game path, I'm going to see 20x information on the ground that you're going to see. And that's just because it's my environment and I have taught myself to see and interpret certain tracks. And when I realized that the trackers call that track awareness, and you go out with some trackers, then we would walk down the road with my teacher and he's seeing 50x what I'm seeing. And that idea in the personal transformational space that there is information, but you have to teach yourself to see it.
Yeah.
You have to attune to specific information for you. That's a mind-blowing idea. Because if anywhere where you are in the transformation, you start without knowing, you start to get a few first tracks, man, and then you start to realize like, okay, there are unique things that when I do them, it's a special kind of energy that comes into me. And that is, how do you develop your track awareness? You start paying attention to what energizes you in unique ways, where you have a unique skill and energy and desire, and it literally lights you up when you're doing it. That is your track awareness. And then inevitably, if you start this process, and what I'm describing is a practice, you live in this, the discipline of the tracker is awareness. So every day you're going without knowing, you're working with the first track, you're developing your track awareness, you're being willing to go without knowing. And then inevitably you start to shift your identity. You start to move into some new things. And then sure enough, you lose the track. Now, if you're in a transformation, you're stepping out of a relationship, you're stepping out of a career or transitioning something in your business, you lose the track, it can be really scary because I'm not what I was. We're not yet what we will be as a business, as a team, as an individual. Now I lose the track. It's very important to know that losing the track is a part of tracking. So that when you suddenly feel like, oh, I'm in this liminal space, that's okay. What do the great trackers do? They will go back to where they last had a clear track. The other thing that they will do is they move into a mentality of discovery. or throughout our life, we were told from school up, you got to be right, you got to get it right. And you're told in our culture, you got to know exactly what you're doing. The trackers operate in a state of open discovery. If they lose the track, they go back to the last clear track, and then they'll try things. They'll walk up ahead, they'll walk half circles, they'll check open game paths. Anywhere where they don't find a track is not wasted. That is helping them refine where the track might be. That is what I say, that is part of the path of not here. And certainly in my life, I've spent a lot of time on the path of not here. Like I've done a lot of things that were not my track, but all of that helped me refine where I want to go. And so you can see how the tracking metaphor starts to come alive. What I would say is don't track alone. Try and find people around you who, like your community, who want to be a part of this transformation, who are also seeking. You want to get out of the density of people who will sell you their fears. You want other people who are saying, we're also attuning, we're also looking for a new way of living that feels like more of a self-expression of who we are. And then the final thing I would say is that, well, everything I'm describing is a practice, you know, it's a practice. And along the way too, if you watch great trackers, they enter into an energy state. Like if you watch my two teachers, Alex and Renius, as they're following, they're clicking their fingers. One is saying, I'm on the track. If it cuts left, the other one will be on it. They're vectoring the general direction that animal is moving. They're using trees up ahead as waypoints. They're seeing the faintest tracks you can imagine where a lion has picked up its foot and some sand has fallen off onto the grass. They're seeing things that they've taught themselves to see. And in that energy, when you watch them closely, they are profoundly committed to finding that animal somewhere up ahead. But they don't allow that commitment to finding it to be a pressure that takes them out of this moment. And it is if they are using the track to generate a playful energy of simply working on their craft. And where this stuff gets really interesting is where you are so enjoying the presence and attunement of your own transformation, being aware every day of what your track is, what energizes you, being aware of moment to moment constrictions, redirecting, playing in your own becoming. Eventually you pop out in an identity, and usually what will happen is someone else will name you as something. Oh, this is this person. Something that you didn't even imagine, and you'll realize you've become something. People see you in a certain way. There is an identity that has emerged, but you don't even care about it because you are so engaged in the joy of living on the track of your life day to day.
All right, so I'm just like this. I'm just like listening. Okay, so I want to bring this to a close. I could listen to you talk about this for many hours, and what I would say is what you just summarized. You have an online course. It's the Track Your Life online course. People go to boydvarty.com if they want to take the course. Is that right?
Yeah, we've got a course that helps you do some inner tracking. That's boydvarty.com, and if people are interested in continuing to go inner tracking, it's a helpful tool along the way.
Yeah, I was going to say, so there's so much, it's so rich. There's so much that you just said, and this is our inner work. And so, but you've created both in the book, The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life, and in this online course, basically a step-by-step guide where because I've done it too. There's a series of prompts, questions, and videos that you make that go into a lot of detail about this process, and then prompts that get people to reflect. And this is a lot of work, but it's amazing work. And I love that you emphasize the playful energy. I think we can all feel your playful energy, and what a gift. Go ahead,
Can
please.
I say one thing about it? And just to people in your audience, like the bigger reason of why I want everyone to track and find the path of their own life is I believe that we are looking for new ways of living, and I think that people who are willing to live like this, I have found that they become almost like I call it the tribe of forgotten trackers. Those who are willing to really follow and be on this path of transformation, to track their own life, they make new ways of being. They make new businesses. They make new creations. They are where originality flows, and they make a new way of living. And I think we're somewhat in need of that. It's like a modern day activism to me, because people who really get into touch with the track of their own life, I've seen some characteristics. Like one is they become overwhelmed by a sense of enough. and I mean, I have enough, I am enough, inevitably they turn their attention to service and the upliftment of other people, their community, the natural world. They almost always become more creative for the sake and the joy of simply being creative. Um, they simplify their lives, they turn to nature. And so I just find that people who find that become the people who sort of help us make a new world in these times that are somewhat turbulent and confusing. And that's why I am an advocate of it, because I really believe it's individuals who make this way of being.
Sure. So this is your inner work, but you're being of service to others, of course. You're sharing it so widely.
Yeah, and I would say that, like, I'm not even trying to, it's just what happens when I get in touch with my own heart.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I love the connection between a perception of having enough and then the natural tendency from that foundation to want to be of service, to give to others.
Mhm.
I do work with a number of people who are quite wealthy. Their net worth number is congratulatory. I give them a standing ovation. And then I say, so you, I guess, are adequately resourced. So
Mhm.
as you were talking, I was thinking, oh, adequately resourced. If this is the perception, and what if we all realize that we're adequately resourced? So I'm hearing you say some version of that, and then from that foundation of confidence, you bring that out as a gift to others.
I mean, adequately resourced is so nice because I'm not even talking about financial economics. I'm just talking about, but that's a part of it, the fullness of just having a cup, because you did the work of going without knowing, of finding your first track, of losing the track. By the way, that's difficult. You know, one thing that I say is that Joseph Campbell used to have this thing, find your bliss and follow your bliss. That's
Mhm.
not the whole quote. The rest of the quote is, some people will not understand what you're doing and won't respect you, but at least you will be in your life. And I think that's quite important to say, that to live like this and to really, whether you're leading a company, when you start to go after a different way of doing things, it's challenging and it can be lonely and it can be confronting. And it can be deeply, deeply rewarding. So I don't want to just make it sound like, oh yeah, it's like this woofy thing to just be in personal transformation. It's usually quite hard to genuinely step towards a new way of being, a new identity. And so it takes courage, and that's a part of it too.
Yeah. Well, you, sir, are courageous, and what I love is that you are giving a gift to others by codifying and finding language, and really quite beautiful language, to describe a process that the rest of us can also participate in. Even though here's my envy coming out again. Even though we didn't get to grow up in the bush, surrounded by these wild animals, and with these amazing characters in your life, these wonderful people who love you and taught you all these things, and then you honor them, of course, by teaching the rest of us. So it's an honor to speak to you. So
Thank
thank
you,
you
man.
so much. Okay, so what we're gonna do is I'm gonna end the recording now, and then I'll open it up to the group. For those of you who are
Okay,
watching
cool.
this recording, you're like, wait, what? If you're a part of the Executive Mastermind program, you get to ask Boyd some questions in person here. But for those just watching, we're gonna stop the recording now. I hope this was a rich conversation that inspired you to go beyond your perceived limits. Thank you.
Thank you.